For this video, I wanted to look at food presentation and some of the techniques and principles that I find really useful. These aren't going to be the sort of gimmicks or hacks that you sometimes see videos about, but rather some ideas about how you can approach food so that you can make good creative decisions and beautiful dishes that still keep flavour and deliciousness as the main focus. Ultimately, to me, cooking is a craft with a strong creative element to it. And so how we choose to present and communicate our work to our guests is one of the areas where there's the most scope for us to express that creativity and make things our own. So for today, I've tried to choose some principles to talk about that you can easily fit into your own food and your own style. So let's start out by talking about colour theory, which is something that I think can be useful, not as a strict set of rules, but still something that can be helpful to have a working understanding of. Colour theory is the science and art of how colours relate to each other and how we experience and interpret them. Obviously, that is a huge subject, and we're just going to dip into it here to have a quick look at the colour wheel and some basic colour harmony principles. Complementary colours is probably the most useful and easy to understand of these principles. And essentially, complementary colours are colours that are on the opposite side of the colour wheel from one another. So you have blue and orange, or red and green, and they look good together, they complement each other, but they also contrast nicely and stand out against each other without clashing. So if you wanted an item to stand out against its background, you could place it on its complementary colour. So something that was orange placed on a blue plate, for example. And I'll talk more about how that can be useful to us in a moment. The other colour harmonies that I'll quickly mention are split complementary, and that's where you choose a dominant colour and then the two colours either side of the colour that's opposite that on the colour wheel. And then also sometimes helpful to think about are monochromatic and analogous colour harmonies. Monochromatic being a dish that only uses one colour but potentially in different shades, and that doesn't come up very often, but it can be really striking. And then analogous colour harmonies take the colours that all sit next to each other on the colour wheel. Of course, you don't have to worry about these things or use them, and they definitely aren't rules you should follow, but it can be useful to have a bit of an understanding, at least of something like complementary colours, I think, if you're brainstorming or working on ideas for how you might want to present a dish. For example, I mentioned choosing plates before, but it can also be handy if you're working with things like edible flowers. For instance, I have a fairly unusual dish on my menu with quite striking colour use. It's this marinated tofu stuffed with spiced mushrooms and pickled apple, and then it's served with a sauce that's made with a blue algae miso that I make. And so it's got this really unusual, vibrant, natural blue colour to the sauce. When I was plating it up and deciding how to serve it, that was one of the things that I wanted to think about how to present best. So I finished that dish with a nasturtium petal, and even just having a sort of unconscious understanding of colour theory then helps to make the decision as to what variety of nasturtium to grow and to use. So of course, don't let these ideas dictate what you choose to do, and certainly don't let them influence flavour, but they can be something that's just useful maybe as a brainstorming tool. So then from talking about their colour, let's move on to talking a bit more about other ways of using natural elements within food. Bringing nature into the presentation of dishes is something that I really like doing. It doesn't overcomplicate things, and it can be really nice to have those visual ways of linking the dish back to the natural world. So of course you can buy herbs and edible flowers and plants, and where possible I like to grow myself or forage as many of those sorts of elements for the menu as I can. And so something like nasturtiums is a great example because you can eat the petals and the leaves, you get these beautiful interesting colours from the flowers and a nice sort of pepperiness to them that can pair really well with certain dishes. And that is an important thing to think about. You don't want to just throw things onto a plate just because they happen to look pretty. If you can have a link and a way that it enhances the flavour or helps you communicate something about the dish, that to me is really important. Ultimately, anything you're adding should ideally really enhance the dish and highlight it at its best. So another example I'd use of my own is that when I had a dish that featured the flavour of honey prominently on the menu, I would serve it with this crisp honey garnish made from caramelised honey, and then drizzle that with more fresh honey, so that I was really emphasising those particular flavours and visually you being drawn to an ingredient that otherwise might not necessarily stand out in the way it was drizzled over the dish. And you're adding texture, but fundamentally all of those flavours really worked together and made sense, and the concept of the dish, as well as the flavours, was all working in harmony. Or there's this spruce and larch cone sorbet that I make, and so for that I actually make a kind of little crisp to garnish it, and that's made with the leftover spruce needles after they've been infused to make the sorbet itself. So you're getting something that's visual, that makes it look pretty, but you are still adding flavour and texture that makes sense and works well with the dish, and that again helps to kind of highlight the concept behind the dish and give you another link back to nature. Or also, thinking about that dish, something that can be interesting to play about with is bringing natural elements into the serving of a dish, even if they're not going to be an edible aspect of it. So serving something with flavours of pine on top of a bed of pine needles, so you get the aromatics from that and also this visual cue to the flavours in the dish, can be something interesting to play with. Or I had a dish that was finished with edible herbs from the garden, and so serving that over this layer of edible plants and other herbs and flowers from the garden, again just really draws you into that little world and the concept at the heart of the dish. But it could also be as simple as just putting little natural elements on the table, or serving little bouquets of herbs that can go alongside and complement a dish with aromatics, and again give you this visual link back to the flavours used in it. Then, of course, what you choose to serve your dishes on is a really important decision, and I mentioned, the colour of dishes in our section on colour theory, but there's a few other really important things to consider when it comes to plates. Probably the most important thing about serviceware is how it's going to affect how a particular dish eats and how the guests interact with the food. Whether they're going to have to use cutlery or their hands, or even pick up a specific part of a dish. These can be really important things to think about, especially in the context of a tasting menu where you've got multiple courses, and so how the guests are interacting with them and having some variety is really important, I think. I've had some beautiful looking dishes that don't end up actually getting used on the menu because the thing that I wanted to serve in them just doesn't eat that well when you put it in that particular dish. And then on the flip side of that, I have some plainer looking things that are just so practical and work so well that they get a lot of use. So I have these stone bowls that I serve the nettle soup in, and I do think that they're beautiful, but they're reasonably plain. It's sort of their texture and their weight that makes them really lovely, I think. But because they hold their heat as well, and because of the sort of heft to them, they work fantastically for serving this dish. Luckily, I'm in the position now where I get to work with people on the tableware that I use. So there's a fantastic ceramicist, Becky Morris, who makes all of the black ceramicware that I work with, and so it's really nice to be able to talk about the concept of dishes and have her work on things that are going to be bespoke, not just to the menu but to that particular dish. And she made these beautiful ceramic rings that I serve this chocolate truffle that's flavoured with distilled Scotch bonnet chilies in it. That's a really nice thing to have, and we wanted to make something that made use of negative space. And this truffle's unusual because during the low temperature distillation, I get to capture the flavour of the chilies but without any of their spice. And because it was quite an unusual flavour, I wanted to also have a striking presentation. And so getting to work directly with a ceramicist like Becky is an amazing and very privileged way to get to present that. If you can find ceramicists working local to you or other people making interesting dishes, maybe things with glass, then it's a great idea to visit them or have a chat with them. Or even if they're not going to make something bespoke for you, sometimes you can visit open studios. And one of the things I've done over the years that I would recommend is Whether it's in environments like that or even just in little shops, picking up interesting dishes and pieces of serviceware and then just having them available to kind of play about with and test things in can be a really creatively fulfilling thing, I think. Next, I want to talk about using layers and hiding elements of a dish. A real strength of this approach is that you can be totally focused on creating something delicious and having the flavors, textures and temperatures exactly as you want them, and then you're just creating a slight element of intrigue by hiding them under a layer that could be a natural element or could be something more intricate that you've made. When I see food that's presented like this, it's generally a good indication to me that flavour is at the forefront of the mind of the person that's making it. And of course you can make more complex and visually appealing layers, and I'll talk about 2 techniques for that in a moment. But it can also be very simple, using natural elements like leaves and petals that we talked about, or just thinking about how elements that would be in the dish anyway are layered together. And what's also very appealing about this for me is that it tends to be a less fiddly way of presenting food, which, given that I work on my own, putting together a tasting menu is really appealing, because I do like to have some little complex elements, but if you're having to spend a lot of time on plating up each dish, then that really becomes limiting on how quickly you can get that food out, unless you have a team where a number of people can be working on that at once. So from talking about using layers and kind of hiding away elements of a dish, it makes sense to go on to talk about one of the techniques that I'm really fond of and I've done a whole video about, which is making this crisp, brittle fruit glass. This is fruit juice that I thicken with pectin and then dry out to these transparent little crisps. And I really like these because I do like the look that it gives you, but also you can be really intentional about how you're using a technique like this and use flavors that work with the dish and add texture in a really interesting way. So you don't have to think about something like this as a garnish. It can be really an element that's enhancing and making your dish come together in a particular way. I've got a whole video about how I make the fruit glass and the technique in detail, so I'll put a link to that down in the description. But for me, this is definitely one of the things that I'm most drawn to as a way of adding flavour and texture and this lovely visual element to a dish. And then in a similar vein to that, using a mould to make crisps out of vegetables or fruit can also work brilliantly. Again, I have a video where I go in depth about the whole process for this. And again, one of the reasons that I like this is because it's a way of not just adding something visual, you're not just garnishing something, but you're also adding flavour and texture. And if used thoughtfully, I think this can be really effective. For instance, I had a dish where I was making carrot charcuterie with koji, and I would serve that underneath a little carrot crisp. So the guests would break through this carrot crisp to get through to the carrot charcuterie dish hidden underneath. I do think with the moulds there's a little bit more of a risk of them being overused sometimes. Because they're something that's commercially available, you do sometimes see the same moulds being used in similar ways by a couple of people, and therefore the food's starting to maybe look a little bit similar. But used well and used in interesting ways, it can still be a really, really effective thing to do. Next up might be one of the points where I potentially contradict myself, but simplifying things and stripping things away is definitely something that within my own food I focus on and think about as part of the presentation, but also just part of how I conceptualize what I want to serve. Now, I do love intricately plated dishes and people that work like that, and I do have a few things like that myself as well, but I'm talking in broad principles, I guess, about the idea of taking away anything that isn't necessary, or at least going through the mental exercise of thinking about whether something is necessary or adding something to a dish. There's this Coco Chanel quote about the idea that before you leave the house, you should look in the mirror and take one item off. And I think sometimes that can be a good way of thinking about food. Certainly if you have something that's got a lot going on, just thinking about whether you need all of that. Is it all serving the dish and does it all make sense? Lastly, and potentially going against everything that I've just said, some of the most interesting work that I see and some of my favourite of my own dishes go against some or all of the principles that I've mentioned so far. And that is as important as anything else, I think. Sometimes it's important to know when to have the confidence to just go along with what you think is creatively interesting and what you might want to do. So take everything with a pinch of salt, I think. Like with music or photography, there are principles and theory that you can learn that will help you to produce things that are good, but a lot of the most exciting work out there really purposefully breaks or plays with those rules and the theory, or completely ignores them. So if you've made it through to the end of this, then I hope that you found something interesting or useful within it. And if you have other thoughts or other things that you particularly like to think about, then let me know in the comments. I try and read what everyone says. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.